Myself and my two business partners have been publishing ski since '95. It's a long time, and we've remained the #1 snow sports site. It's been hard work, it's had its ups and downs, and there's been a lot of change in that time, as you could imagine. My experience is mostly as a digital publisher, and my contract work at the moment in the last few years is almost entirely in that space. I've touched with e-commerce and online travel and a few other things, but I'm an also-ran, right? So I've had my day in the sun, and it was pretty good for a while, but now it's just, it's just another business, and it's waxed and waned over the years. And today, the only thing that keeps it going is the fact that it's still #1, and there's an element of just pride and stubbornness, but it's also become my business card, so I keep tapping away at it to keep it relevant. In 1995, I was managing a ski shop, being a keen skier, and that's just one of the segues of life, and I ended up in a ski shop in Newcastle. And that's how snow reports were. They came in on a fax into the ski shops, and they came into they also went into a fax to the accommodation businesses down in the snow. So for anybody who was a keen skier, there was, on Thursday nights on the 7 o'clock NBN News, you would get a snippet of a snow report, but it was, being as NBN was part of Channel 9, it was completely Perisher focused, because Packer owned Perisher, and it just sold everything as great all the time. And that was how snow reports were all over the world. And they had a bad reputation, so you pretty much relied on word of mouth. Or you walked past the ski shops in the morning. We used to have, not hundreds, but we would have dozens and dozens of people walk past the ski shop in the morning during ski season just to get a snow report. So one day this fellow walks in, he's a customer, and he says, "Let's put the snow reports on the internet." And I go, "Great, what's the internet?" And he was a PhD student here at Newcastle Uni. He's a complete propeller head, doing PhD in physics in over-the-horizon radar. And he was a keen skier. So I swapped him a pair of ski boots, and he put the snow reports online. We used to just fax. I'd get the fax in the morning, and god-awful thermal paper, sticky tape it to another piece of paper, fax it back to Ian at the uni, and he would type it into Notepad and put it up on the internet. It was just so simple. And next thing we knew, it was like the #2 most popular site in the country, with these very early reports that started to come in from a couple of the ISPs, and we just went, wow, how did we do that? Like you couldn't even tell. And it started to get quite busy, and our ISP was really interested in what we were doing. And in the beginning, we had a known business plan. If any of you like South Park, you would know the known business plan. It's like, no idea how we make money out of this. And then one day I get a phone call, it was in '96, and it's a guy who's running an accommodation business in Jindabyne. And he just says, "How much to advertise on your website?" And this is pre-GST, and I went, $199. And he went, "Okay." And I've always regretted not keeping the first check that turned up. So we incorporated it and turned it into a business. And we had a few more sales later in that year, but this is a few $100s. This is nothing. Anyway, Ian walks in early January '97, and he says, "Have a look at this website." And he points to a website. It was kind of the Aspen snow site, but it was really random. It was probably GeoCities or something like that. And there was a webcam there, and he said, "If we don't do that, we can forget about this." So I said, it was just immediately obvious. This is what you wanted as a skier. It was like, it was a no-brainer. Here's the snow. I'm in the city, there's the snow, and now I can see it. I don't need to listen to the nonsense that the snow reporters are telling us. So we decided this was a good idea, and then we tried to figure out how we're going to make it happen. And back in the day, of course, there was no networks, there was no internet. Of course, the original webcam in the world was coffee cam, and basically it's CCTV, security cameras, and you had to pipe them through a PC with a video card and capture that, and then figure out how you were going to get that image onto the internet and so on. So, but we thought it was doable, and in a moment of madness, I rang up Channel 7 and just pitched this idea, and it was like one call, and I must have been in the right place at the right time. I got through the gatekeepers, and I spoke to the right guy, this business development manager, and it was maybe a 2-minute conversation, and he just went, "We're in." So now we had to actually build a camera and make it work. We had no idea how to do it. So this was probably, I don't know, March or April. And it was the year of the Thredbo disaster. And that gave us a couple of, because I had lived and skied in Thredbo for a couple of years. So I had all these connections in Thredbo. So the first camera was going to be Thredbo. And off we went. And it was delayed by a couple of months, and we ended up putting it in late September because of the Thredbo disaster. And the damn thing just worked. We walked away and it worked, which revealed itself later as absolute luck. And we got back home after a few days down the snow and rang the business development manager and said, "There it is, it's online, it's working." He said, "Ripper, how many more can you do?" So I said, 15. And that began a process of me ringing the ski resorts for a few months and trying to get cameras in. And of course, none of them had budget for the internet and so on. So one of the first early learnings that I had, and at the time I was reading all about the open source movement, was that there is no better deal than free, right? Free is a lock-in strategy. Because if you give something to someone for free, nobody else can come along later and go, "We'll charge you less," because it doesn't get any less than free. And the arrangement that we made was that we would provide the images, and they would be our intellectual property, and we would supply them back for free for their own website. And we knew then at that time that all that mattered was that we had all of the cameras, and a ski resort only had the Thredbo resort cameras, and Perisher only had Perisher cameras. So, and of course their websites were also infant at the time, if non-existent for some of the ski resorts. And I played off the ski resorts one after the other, and eventually we stitched up all of the resorts in Australia, and I had these contracts. And then the business development manager at Channel 7 got shipped off, and I got a new business development manager, and she invited us down to Sydney and said, for a meeting, and then she sat there and said, "Well, webcams are cute, but they're not good content, so we're dropping this." So there I was with all the contracts, holding this commitment, and it's the cliche of, "Mum, Dad, I need some money." So both myself and Ian ended up, haranguing our parents and anyone who would listen, and we scooped up enough capital to actually just go out and do it ourselves. And in the long run, it turned out to be the best thing ever that Channel 7 did for us, was because then it was ours. We didn't have any overlords. We just owned it, and it was the killer idea. We put in 17 cams for the 1998 season, and then we discovered that most of them stopped working really quickly because it was Windows 95, and we ended up doing 5 trips to the ski resorts and like 15,000 kilometres. making these stupid things bloody work. But it was a great ride. And I had to make some money because we had all this debt. So we started selling advertising because that was the only thing that made sense. And in those days it was banners, and it was the old 486x60 ad, and it was a lot of hard work for a few years. But it got better. And I might point out, at this point here, we also realised that the real bread and butter was actually going to be accommodation and putting bums in beds, and that started to grow. So we had advertising from banners, but our interest lay with getting all of the accommodation providers online, accommodation operators. However, you had to chase the money, and the money was coming in from advertising. Over the next few years, the what was called the effective CPM was just going up and up and up, and we had an agency and in Sydney that started selling for us, and we had a good relationship with them for about 10 years or more, and that all went really well. And during this time, so we're getting to, in this time, there's also the dotcom bubble. And that was when a few investors started sniffing around and talking to us, and most of them, it doesn't go anywhere. But we had one investor, or potential investor, and the conversation started to get pretty serious. And it's just pre-99, pre the end of the pre the dotcom bust back then, and we hit a stumbling block, and it was one of those things you just don't see coming. And it was that the ski.com.au domain had been registered in a time which was so early, back in 95, that it couldn't be shifted, and it couldn't, from their point of view, it couldn't be turned into an asset. So we had this block, and lawyers started getting involved, and they are so expensive and they don't help much. And it was feeling really exciting. We were going to get this big corporate in Sydney was going to invest in the site, and then the bubble just crashed, and boom, they were gone like that, just overnight, just disappeared, never heard from them again. So again, we just kept going on our merry way, and the publishing, which effectively was the driver of the business, became pretty good. And at one point, so by around about 2005, 2006, we're 9 people, having a great time, hoofing off to the snow whenever it suited us. Everybody loved us, free ski holidays, doesn't get better. But the party always ends. It always ends. And what happened was a number of things collided in around about 2006. So one of them was the two parts of our business, which is basically selling advertising and trying to get accommodation online. And we'd spent a lot of money in the sort of mid-2000s trying to get a booking engine in place for ourselves. And the lesson that we learned out of that was it doesn't scale. Building technology for 300 potential customers, it's really expensive. And What If came in and just hoovered it up, just because they didn't go, oh, ski lodges. They went, oh, the whole of Australia. And very quickly, they had a lot of money, and $30 million of capital to invest in engineering means that you just can't keep up. So that meant that you had to. I rang them up one day just because after we'd blown like a couple of $100,000 on technology that went nowhere, and I rang them up. I rang up What If shortly after they had gone on the IPO. And they had listed, and they had got whatever it was, $50 or $100 million in capital, and said, are you doing an affiliate plan? And they said, oh, yes. And so we became the first affiliate, which was good, but then, you know, you're just on their coattails. There's no way you can take your growth. And the other thing that happened in this period was Google purchased DoubleClick. DoubleClick was the biggest network advertiser in the world at the time, and Google was all about search marketing. So effectively, Google then bought up the bulk of the world's display advertising, threw all their engineers at it, made it incredibly efficient, and effective CPMs started to drop, and they fell like a stone. And so back here, when we were getting what was good money, $45 or better, up to $80, it dropped down to $5 pretty quickly. Sat there for a long time, and after a while it sits there about $1, right? And the reason for that is that the internet just scales infinitely. It's like selling sand, you know, there's no limit to banner impressions. And so the only people who end up making money is the transport company. And that transport company is Google. And the other thing is that after 10 years, we just saddled with a bucket load of old tech. You know, technology has the shelf life of a banana, and you've got to keep turning it over, and you have to throw at about 10 years, you basically just have to throw out everything that you had, and you effectively start all over again. And so that's what happened to us in around 2008. All our webcams that were running on PC-based systems had come to an end of life. The bum had fallen out of the display advertising market. We were getting crushed in putting bums in beds, you know, the booking engine stuff by What If, and we basically had to start all over again, and we rebuilt the site from scratch. And so that's the lesson, is you have to have your game plan, it just keeps changing. You've got to flow with current market conditions, and whatever is happening, the internet, all business moves pretty quickly, but nothing moves quite as fast as digital, and you just keep moving and changing. And then the other thing that happens is that everything just needs more and more engineering. And one of my mantras is, he who has the most engineers wins. And you see that today with Facebook and Google. They just hoover up as many of the best, you know, 10x coders and engineers that they can, because that's the moat, that's the competitive advantage. So this brings me to where I'm at today, is that if you're in digital, this is how I view it. This is how a couple of the colleagues that I work with in Sydney see it as well, is you have 4 pillars, and if you don't have them in balance, you have nothing. And they are platform, content, audience, and monetization. And of course, content could be product, and audience could be customers. So platform is basically your tech stack. Content, you've just got to have great content or great product. That's just the price of entry. There's no, you know, second rate doesn't even get a look in. People are, if you're in the content business, scrolling through their Facebook feed at a rate of knots. And there's, you know, any one of you scrolling through your Facebook feed has probably scrolled past $1 million of production in a couple of hours. You just scroll through, and guess what? You ignore it. And then eventually you click one of them. So it's just great content on great products, the price of entry. For product, the leverage is always usability. It's got to be a great user experience. It's got to be world-class, or it doesn't even fly. Then you have to have the numbers. You have to have the numbers in audience or customers. And then you actually have to have a monetization. You have to know that you're selling something. And that's often forgotten. It's easy to look past and just go, oh, well, we're all about a great idea, or we're hitting huge numbers. I had a period in the mid-2000s where I'd be getting called all the time by people who had no idea really hadn't looked at the site, and they'd be saying, oh, we can get you more traffic. And I'd say, great, I don't want any more traffic, it's sending me broke. Because in the mid-2000s, it was so expensive with hosting. Of course, today, the same thing, what was costing us $4,000 or $5,000 a month in the mid-2000s would cost you a couple $100 on Amazon Web Services today. But if it's very easy to have a lot of traffic and a lot of customers, and it's valueless. And so you absolutely have to have a monetization approach and plan and know that you are selling something, and it starts with knowing that you're going to sell something. And catch a rising tide. I'm just here because I happened to catch a rising tide. It was all serendipitous. But if you're in the space and you can see a trend, you jump on it as fast as you can see it. So in 2007, the iPhone came out. Well, all of the app developers, which were developing apps for Windows, flew as fast as they could to Apple. And that was the beginning of the end of Microsoft's product, because without app developers, they've got nothing. And the reflection of that is the Windows Phone, which I bought one, had one for 2 years, really nice phone, really liked it. Great phone made by Nokia, not an app, not one app, and you really get bored with that. So that's the end of them. The other one is that many people interpret product market fit as basically creating a minimum viable product that addresses and solves a problem. But there's a chap called Mark Anderson of Anderson and Horowitz, and Mark Anderson invented he built Netscape, and now he's one of the, they're not the largest, but they're one of the most interesting venture capital firms. And he sees product market fit as being in a good market with a product that can satisfy that market. And basically that just means make things people want to buy, right? Or they want to use. It's not that complicated, and a lot of people miss it. And probably one of the best in manufacturing of doing this is Samsung. They hardly innovate at all. I mean, they innovate under the surface, but in terms of product, they're just shameless copiers, and they jump on the rising tides as soon as they can. Right? They see a rising tide, they jump on it, and they just shamelessly copy, and they make things people want to buy. And that's the Samsung business model, and that's what your model's got to be. Someone's got to want to buy it, and it's very hard to get into an existing market that's already owned by someone else. The internet's evolved, and there's a piece written by another fellow called Anderson, Chris Anderson. It was written about 5 or 6 years ago, called "The Web is Dead, Long Live the Internet." And if you go back to that article, it's still there on Wired.com. It's really prescient. And from my point of view, www is for selling things. That's it. It's the internet has moved on. It's moved on into different layers. And the only thing left behind on www is basically e-commerce or pathways to e-commerce and yellow pages. And so you're either selling something or the web's a touch point for selling something. And that's kind of all that's left of www, and that the rising tide is happening elsewhere. And that rising tide is basically, if we're looking into the future, is, and again I'm talking in terms of a publisher, not necessarily in biotech, but it's happening in augmented reality, which is looking like becoming the new user interface, artificial reality to a lesser extent in gaming, artificial intelligence, and that's kind of already owned by Google. And part of the reason for that is back in '99, Larry Page was famously quoted as in one of the early investor rounds, he wasn't really interested in search, he was interested in artificial intelligence, and that's been their game plan all along. And today, everything that Google does is really a prelude to moving into that space. But it's the rising tide. It'll probably be one of the biggest businesses on the planet, and Google's ideally placed. So if you're in artificial intelligence, then all you can hope for is to do something interesting and get bought by Google or Facebook. And of course, the other space that everyone's talking about is big data. And I just wanted to finish with that. If you are one of the best, it's very difficult to predict the future. And the person that I read religiously is a chap called Benedict Evans, who writes extremely well, really insightful in layman's terms. And he's an analyst with Andreessen Horowitz. And that's it. So if anyone wants to ask some questions about that journey.